There's a version of you that you refuse to acknowledge. A part of yourself that shoved so far down into the darkness that convinced yourself it doesn't exist. But it does. And right now, as you're reading this, it's pulling the strings, making you react in ways you don't understand. Sabotaging the things you want, showing up in the people you hate. This isn't some spiritual nonsense, this is psychology. And if you don't face what you've buried, it will keep running your life from the shadows. Psychologist Carl Jung spent his entire career studying something he called the shadow self. It's not your dark side in some evil villain kind of way. It's every part of you that you decided wasn't acceptable. Every emotion you were told was wrong. Every desire you were taught to be ashamed of. Every trait that got you punished or rejected or laughed at. You didn't kill those parts of yourself. You buried them alive. And they're still down there, in the basement of your mind, screaming to be seen. The problem is, when you ignore your shadow, it doesn't just sit there quietly. It leaks out. It controls you in ways you can't see. It makes you judge others for the exact things you can't accept in yourself. And until you turn around and look at what you've been running from, you'll never actually be free. Today, we're going deep into the psychology of the shadow self, because understanding this might be the most important thing you ever do for your mental health. Let's start with what the shadow really is, because most people get this wrong. Your shadow isn't just your anger or your jealousy or your selfishness. It's way bigger than that. The shadow is everything about you that doesn't fit the image you're trying to maintain. It's the gap between who you think you should be and who you actually are. And here's the wild part. Your shadow doesn't just contain the bad stuff. It also contains the good stuff that you were never allowed to express. Your confidence, your creativity, your sexuality, your power, your joy. If you grew up in an environment where being too happy made others uncomfortable, guess what? Your natural joy got buried in the shadow. If expressing anger got you punished, your healthy aggression went down there too. If being smart made you a target, you learned to hide your intelligence. Jung said that the shadow is made up of everything we reject about ourselves and push into the unconscious. Think about that for a second. Every time someone told you to stop crying, you learned that sadness wasn't acceptable. Every time you got yelled at for being too loud, you learned that your natural energy was wrong. Every time you were shamed for wanting attention, you learned that your needs were a burden. So what did you do? You created a persona, a mask, a version of yourself that you showed to the world because you learned that being your full self wasn't safe, and everything that didn't fit that persona got shoved into the shadow. You built this perfect image of who you're supposed to be, and everything that contradicted that image had to go. But here's the thing Jung discovered. You can't actually destroy parts of yourself. You can only repress them. And repression doesn't make things go away. It makes them stronger, it makes them unconscious, which means they start running your life without you even realizing it. Your shadow becomes this hidden force that influences everything you do. Your choices, your relationships, your reactions, the things that trigger you, the people you're drawn to, the patterns you can't break. All of it is being controlled by parts of yourself that you refuse to look at. And the really messed up part, the things you hate most in other people are usually the things you've buried in yourself. Jung called this projection. When you can't accept something in yourself, you see it everywhere in others. You become hypersensitive to it. That person who's always putting themselves first. You can't stand them because you've buried your own needs so deep that watching someone prioritize themselves feels like a personal attack. That friend who's always honest about how they feel. You think they're too much because you've spent your entire life suppressing your emotions. The person who's confident and takes up space, you label them arrogant because you were taught that being seen was selfish. You're not actually seeing them clearly. You're seeing your own shadow reflected back at you. This is why shadow work is so brutal. Because it forces you to admit that the things you judge most harshly in others are the things you're terrified of finding in yourself. And that's a hard pill to swallow. It's way easier to point fingers, to blame other people, to keep convincing yourself that you're nothing like them. But the truth is, if it triggers you that intensely, it's because it's touching something in your shadow, something you've been trying desperately to keep hidden. So how does this happen? How do we end up with these massive parts of ourselves locked away in the dark? It starts in childhood. And it's not always because of abuse or trauma, though that definitely contributes. It happens in normal families too, because every family has rules about what's acceptable and what's not, what gets rewarded and what gets punished, what makes you lovable and what makes you a problem. When you're a kid, your survival depends on being accepted by your caregivers. That's not dramatic. That's biology. You literally need them to stay alive. So when they send you signals that certain parts of you are unacceptable, you learn real fast to hide those parts. Maybe you were told that boys don't cry. So you learn to bury your sadness, your fear, your vulnerability. You pushed it all down and built this tough exterior because that's what kept you safe. Or maybe you were praised for being the good kid, the quiet one, the one who never caused problems. So you learn that your anger, your boundaries, your ability to say no, all of that had to go. You became the people pleaser because that's how you got love. Or maybe you grew up in a house where one parent was always the center of attention, always in crisis, always needing to be taken care of. So you learned that your needs didn't matter, that taking up space was selfish, that being big or loud or demanding attention was wrong. So you made yourself small. You buried your natural desire to be seen and heard because there was no room for it. And it's not just your family. Society has its own rules about what's acceptable, about what makes you good or bad, worthy or unworthy. Men are taught to bury their emotions, their softness, their need for connection. Women are taught to bury their anger, their ambition, their sexuality. We all get these messages about what's okay to show and what needs to be hidden, and we internalize them. We take these external rules and make them our own. We become our own jailers. We don't need anyone to punish us anymore because we've learned to punish ourselves. We've learned to reject parts of ourselves before anyone else can. The shadow grows every time you deny feeling, every time you suppress a reaction, every time you tell yourself that what you're experiencing isn't valid or isn't allowed. It grows when you smile through your anger, when you pretend you're fine when you're falling apart, when you say yes when you mean no, when you shrink yourself to make others comfortable. All of those moments, all of those denials, they don't just disappear. They go into the shadow. They pile up. And eventually you've got this massive, unconscious part of yourself that you don't even know is there. But it's there. And it's influencing everything. Jung talked about how the shadow develops in layers. The top layers are the things you're somewhat aware of. The thoughts and feelings you push away, but could access if you really tried. But underneath that are deeper layers. Things you've been repressing for so long, but you've completely forgotten they exist. Trauma, shame, parts of your identity that got rejected so early that you can't even remember a time when you had access to them. These deeper layers are the ones that really run the show, because they're so unconscious that you have no idea they're influencing you. You think you're making conscious choices, but really, you're just acting out patterns that were set decades ago. And here's what makes it even more complicated. Your shadow isn't just personal. Jung believed we also carry a collective shadow. The things that our culture, our society, our species has repressed, the darkness that humanity refuses to look at. And that collective shadow shows up in the world as prejudice, as war, as the horrible things we do to each other when we refuse to acknowledge the darkness within ourselves. When we can't face our own shadow, we project it onto entire groups of people. We make them the enemy. We dehumanize them. We convince ourselves that the evil is out there, not near. And that's how atrocities happen. That's how ordinary people do terrible things, because they haven't done the work of integrating their shadow. So what does it actually look like when your shadow is running your life? Because that's the thing. Most people have no idea that this is happening. They think they're in control. They think they're making conscious decisions. But if you look closely, you'll see the shadow everywhere. It shows up in your triggers. Those moments when you have an emotional reaction that's way bigger than the situation calls for. Someone makes a small comment and you're suddenly furious, or devastated, or completely shut down. That disproportionate response, that's your shadow. Something in that moment touched a wound you've been avoiding, a part of yourself you can't accept, and instead of feeling it, you react, you lash out, you withdraw. You do whatever you learn to do to avoid looking at what's really there. It shows up in your relationships. You keep attracting the same type of person over and over. The same dynamic keeps playing out. You think it's bad luck or that you're just choosing wrong. But really, your shadow is pulling you toward people who reflect the parts of yourself you haven't integrated. If you're terrified of your own anger, you'll find yourself with partners who express it for you. If you've buried your need to be taken care of, you'll end up with people who are helpless and dependent. Your relationships become a mirror for your shadow. And until you look at what's being reflected, the pattern will keep repeating. It shows up in your self-sabotage. You say you want success, but every time you get close, you do something to mess it up. You say you want love, but you push people away the moment they get too close. You say you want to be healthy, but you can't stick to anything that's actually good for you. This isn't weakness. This isn't lack of willpower. This is your shadow. There's a part of you that doesn't believe you deserve good things. A part that's terrified of being seen. A part that learned a long time ago that being too successful or too happy or too anything made you a target, so it sabotages you. It keeps you small and safe because that's what it thinks it needs to do to protect you. It shows up in your judgments. Pay attention to the things you criticize most harshly in other people, the traits that make you instantly dislike someone, the behaviors that fill you with disgust or contempt. Those aren't just random opinions. They're showing you your shadow. Jung said that we criticize most harshly in others what we cannot accept in ourselves. So if you're constantly judging people for being selfish, there's a good chance you've buried your own healthy self-interest. If you can't stand people who are emotional, you've probably repressed your own feelings. If you hate anyone who's loud or takes up space, you've likely made yourself small your whole life, and it shows up in your addictions and compulsions. The things you can't stop doing even though you know they're hurting you. The patterns you repeat even though you hate them, those aren't just bad habits. They're often your shadow trying to get your attention, trying to fill the void where those buried parts of yourself used to be. You're not broken. You're just trying to avoid feeling something that your shadow is holding. And as long as you keep avoiding it, you'll keep needing something to numb it. Here's what happens when you spend your whole life running from your shadow. You become a shell of who you actually are. Because you can't selectively numb parts of yourself. When you bury the anger, you also bury the passion. When you suppress the sadness, you also lose access to joy. When you hide your needs, you also hide your capacity for intimacy. You end up living this half-life where you re-going through the motions, but never really feeling anything, never really connecting, never really being fully alive. And the energy it takes to keep all of that buried. It's exhausting. It's why so many people are chronically tired, anxious, depressed. Because they're spending massive amounts of psychic energy keeping their shadow locked away. Jung said that what we resist persists. The more you fight your shadow, the stronger it gets. The more you try to pretend it's not there, the more it controls you. And eventually, if you ignore it long enough, it stops asking for permission. It just takes over. This is what Jung called being possessed by your shadow. It's when those buried parts break through and you do things that are completely out of character. You have an outburst that shocks everyone, including yourself. You make a decision that destroys everything you've built. You act in ways that you swore you never would. And afterwards, you can't even explain why you did it, because it wasn't really you making that choice. It was your shadow. The scary part is that your shadow doesn't just affect you. It affects everyone around you. When you haven't integrated your shadow, you leak it onto other people. You make them carry the emotions you won't feel. You put them in roles that play out your unconscious dramas. You hurt them in ways you don't even realize because you're reacting from a place you can't see. This is how trauma gets passed down. How dysfunction repeats across generations. How good people do terrible things. Not because they're evil, but because they've never looked at their shadow. So what do you do about it? How do you actually face the parts of yourself you've spent your whole life avoiding? Jung called this shadow work, and it's not easy. It's probably the hardest psychological work you'll ever do, because it requires you to look at the things you least want to see, to admit to the parts of yourself that you've convinced yourself don't exist, to feel the feelings you've been running from since you were a kid. But it's also the most liberating thing you can do, because on the other side of shadow work is wholeness, is freedom, is actually being able to live as your full self instead of this carefully curated version you've been performing. Shadow work starts with awareness. You have to learn to recognize when your shadow is showing up. Notice your triggers. Notice your projections. Notice the patterns that keep repeating. When you have a strong emotional reaction to something, stop and ask yourself why. What is this touching in me? What part of myself am I seeing in this other person that I can't accept? Start paying attention to your judgments. Every time you find yourself harshly criticizing someone, turn it around. What would it mean if that trait existed in me? How have I expressed that in my own life, even if I've tried to hide it? You can work with your dreams. Jung believed dreams are the primary way the unconscious communicates with us. Your shadow shows up in your dreams constantly, in the characters you fear, in the scenarios that disturb you, in the parts of yourself you don't recognize. Start keeping a dream journal. Write them down as soon as you wake up. Look for patterns. Look for the figures that keep appearing. They're showing you your shadow. You can try active imagination. This is a technique Jung developed where you dialogue with your shadow. You close your eyes, you imagine the part of yourself you've been avoiding, and you let it speak. You ask it questions. You listen to what it has to say. It sounds weird, but it's incredibly powerful. Because your shadow isn't your enemy. It's just a part of you that got exiled. And it's been trying to get your attention this whole time. But probably the most important thing is to practice self-compassion. Because when you start seeing your shadow, your first instinct is going to be shame. You're going to want to reject it all over again, to push it back down, to hate yourself for having these parts. But that just strengthens the shadow. Integration happens through acceptance, not rejection. You have to be willing to see these parts of yourself and say, okay, this is also me. This is also part of who I am, and that's okay. You're not trying to become your shadow. You're not trying to act out every impulse and desire that you've repressed. Integration means acknowledging these parts exist, understanding where they came from, and making conscious choices about how to express them in healthy ways. This work is ongoing. It's not something you do once and you're done. The shadow has layers, and as you peel one back, another reveals itself. But every layer you integrate makes you more whole, more authentic, more free. You stop being controlled by parts of yourself you can't see. You stop projecting onto others. You stop sabotaging your own life. You start actually living instead of just performing. And here's the beautiful thing Jung discovered. When you integrate your shadow, you don't just become more aware of your darkness. You also reclaim your light. All those positive qualities you buried because they weren't safe to express. Your creativity, your passion, your power, your joy, they come back. Because they were in the shadow too, waiting for you to be brave enough to look. Subscribe for more deep psychology that actually makes sense.